is the size ratio. This next slide is a photograph of a eukaryotic cell, this big one right here, gobbling up some little tiny prokaryotic cells. Those are strings of bacteria, like 1, 2, 3, 4 bacteria there. And looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 or 12 bacteria there. And you can really see the size of it. It's like an elephant walking around with a bunch of little, I don't know, ground squirrels or something like that. This is actually from your immune system. This is an immune cell, and it goes around gobbling up bacteria to stop you from getting an infection.
So is it correct that the eukaryotic cells are those the ones that are always going to eat the prokaryotic cells?
Are they always going to eat prokaryotic cells? I hate to generalize like that because, well, but I'd say that most of the eukaryotic cells in your body don't have to feed on prokaryotic cells. They get glucose from your blood. But at least some of your immune cells do gobble up prokaryotes.
Can it ever be that like thousands of them ever attack the eukaryotic one? Because I just see that there's only
like could a bunch of little fish chase down a shark or something? I guess that's possible. I've never heard of it.
Okay.
You had a question, Rolanda?
What's like the magnification on that? What would you
Oh,
do?
for this microscope, gee, I don't know.
That would be like something like it would be like an electron microscope or something?
It might be, but if I had to take just a random guess, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 times magnification. The microscopes that we'll be working with in lab go up to 400 times. And you can see eukaryotic cells pretty clearly under our microscopes, but at 400 times, the bacteria just look like tiny, tiny little dots, and you wouldn't be able to see bacteria like that.
In any class here at Cornell, are we ever going to be able to see it like that?
No, as far as I know, we don't have any electron microscopes here, which is probably what this is.
So universities, they would...
Yes, go to a four-year university and say, can I borrow your electron microscope? All right, and back to this diagram again. Well, I guess I already covered this, that the organisms that are in the eukaryote domain are in that domain because they are made out of eukaryotic cells, whereas the bacteria and the archaea, the species in those domains, are made out of the prokaryotic cells. And they are all unicellular. Every bacteria is unicellular and every archaea is unicellular. Most eukaryotic species are multicellular. There are some exceptions. There's one kingdom within the eukaryote domain called the Protista kingdom. And within that kingdom, you do find some single-celled eukaryotes. But everything in the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom and the fungi kingdom are multicellular. All right, well, let's see. The four things I mentioned that all cells have in common, no matter whether they're prokaryotic or eukaryotic cells. Remember, they all have a cell membrane, cytoplasm, chromosomes, or at least one chromosome, and usually more, and ribosomes. What I want to do is go down this list and expand on each one of these a little bit more, starting with the cell membrane. All right, so cell membrane, the outer boundary of the cell. Imagine we're going to zoom in on it like this. It can be sometimes called the plasma membrane or the cell membrane. It is a phospholipid bilayer. And remember that the little squiggly lines are the hydrophobic tails of the phospholipid, so it's extremely hydrophobic in its central region right here. And that allows it to do its main function, which is to be a barrier. The cell wants to keep the solutes inside of it on the inside and not let them escape. And the cell doesn't want any random solutes floating around out here to enter, because then it wouldn't be able to control its internal environment. And so thanks to hydrophilic things not wanting to mix with the hydrophobic membrane, the solutes on the outside stay on the outside, and the solutes on the inside stay on the inside. The membrane is mostly phospholipids, but there are some proteins in it And the proteins are also considered part of the cell membrane. We talked about this type. This is a transport protein, at least that's what I call it. I think most textbooks call it a channel protein or a carrier protein. But its purpose is to very selectively allow solutes through the membrane. These transport proteins have a binding site for just the solutes that are supposed to let through. And then when they bind that correct solute, then they allow it to pass through. Sort of import and export gates for the cells, what the transport proteins are. And we also talked about, so this just illustrates that molecules that don't fit into a particular transport protein won't be transported by that transport protein if they don't fit in the binding site. If the cell wanted to bring in that glucose, it would have to have a different transport protein that specializes in glucose. The other type of protein that's part of the cell membrane is this type. This is a receptor protein. Receptors don't bring things through the membrane, but they detect what molecules are outside the cell. They have a binding site also, and so when the ligand, the molecule that the receptor binds to, clicks into its binding site, the internal part of the receptor alerts the cell, and then the cell knows that that molecule is floating around out there. And typically the cell is pre-programmed and have some response to that molecule.
What's cells together?
Well,
From one cell to another, so you have two cells.
why do they stick together? That's a good question. There are proteins that I'm not showing here that are embedded in the cell membrane that form linkages. In other words, imagine a protein that starts here and reaches across and embeds itself in a neighboring cell's membrane. Those are called adherent molecules. So I guess those can be counted as membrane proteins also.
So it's an actual protein, not anything to do with the hydrogen bond or anything?
No, it's actual proteins that link the two cells together. All right, let's zoom back out for a minute. Some cells, not all cells, but some cells have a rigid structure outside the plasma membrane that's called the cell wall. And here's the reason why some cells have this. Think of a water balloon again. The outer membrane of the cell is fairly delicate. If you could shrink yourself down and poke at a cell with your finger, it would be squishy and soft and very breakable, like a water balloon. And that's kind of a fragile state for a cell to be in. So many cells have a wall outside, a protective wall outside their cell membrane, which is called the cell wall. A good example of these are plant cells. If you look at this diagram of a plant cell, in blue right there you see the actual cell membrane, but outside of it in green is the cell wall. I think when we talked about carbohydrates last week, I mentioned plants have this very tough, fibrous carbohydrate called cellulose, and that's what plant cells construct their cell wall. Bacteria and archaea and some types of fungi and protistans can also have cell walls, although not necessarily made of cellulose. We'll talk about bacteria later on in the semester, but the bacterial cell wall is made out of a different stuff called peptidoglycan, and I forget what archaea cell walls are made out of. But anyway, the point is that many different types of organisms have a cell wall. Animals do not. Our cells have just the good old soft cell membrane like you see there. No cell wall. And maybe I should mention here, just be cautious. Don't mix up the terminology of cell membrane and cell wall. Oftentimes on a quiz I'll ask something about the cell wall, and students will start talking about phospholipid bilayers and stuff like that, and then I'm forced to mark them wrong on that problem. So pay careful attention to the cell wall and the cell membrane, two very different structures. The wall is always outside the cell membrane. Okay, give me 3 more minutes and then we'll conclude for the day. So there's an animal cell. The watery liquid that fills the cell is called the cytoplasm or the cytosol. It's mostly water, but it's not pure water at all. There's a lot of molecules that are dissolved inside the cytoplasm. What molecules? Well, think of all the molecules we've talked about so far this semester. We mentioned a bunch of ions like sodium ions and chlorine ions and phosphate ions. Those are the types of things that you find in here. I mentioned that cells have these ATP molecules floating around inside to power their enzymes. Those are some of the molecules that are in there. Enzymes and other proteins and their building blocks, the amino acids. Carbohydrate molecules like glucose. Lipids and their building blocks, the glycerol and the fatty acids. Nucleotides, RNA molecules, all the molecules and ions that we've talked about this semester you can find floating around inside there. And the organelles themselves, the nucleus and the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus and this one, they float around inside the cytoplasm like little fish or something floating around inside the water inside a fish bowl. So a lot of molecules dissolve in there. And I remember reading somewhere, someone said that if you could shrink yourself down and feel the cytoplasm of a cell, it would not feel watery. There's enough molecules dissolved inside there. It actually has sort of a slippery and slimy feel to it. And one last thing, all cells have chromosomes, like the ones you see here. Yeah, that's probably a good stopping point. We'll pick up again on DNA when we get back to this. All right, I will see you in laboratory. It is lipid laboratory today, I believe. Please don't forget, get me those trip permission forms as soon as you can.